Now, good evening, everybody. By a show of thumbs, can everybody see the presentation? Fantastic, that's great. And also by a show of thumbs, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Alistair Edwards. I'm a principal reporter with the DPEA. I've been in this role for exactly 15 years, actually, this month. And I've covered a range of caseload and examinations and inquiries across the whole of Scotland in my time. Before that, I worked for the City of Edinburgh Council in a range of roles. And I was also a very active member of Planning Aid for Scotland, a role which, on becoming a reporter, I gave up, basically to maintain my integrity and also to avoid any conflict of interest. I'm going to give you a short overview of DPEA before I pass over to Rosie. So what is DPEA? We used to be called the Directorate for Planning and Environmental Appeals until recently, where we've been renamed as a Planning and Environmental Appeals Division, but we've kept the acronym DPEA. We're part of the core Scottish Government. We sit within the legal directorate. However, we do sit at arm's length from the directorate, and we aren't directly instructed by any Scottish ministers or civil servants in our work. And in that way, we are completely independent and impartial. Who are we? Well, at the top of our rung, we have our chief reporter and director, Scott Ferry. He's supported by 3 assistant chief reporters, David, who's here tonight, Alison Cord and Karen Haywood. And then below that, there's 24 of us who are salaried and live across Scotland and North England. And we have a panel of 14 self-employed reporters, which we pool on when we need additional help in conducting our work. We're supported by our administration and support staff who sit in Falkirk and are also home-based. And that's led up by our head of performance, David Henderson. Now, as reporters, we have a range of professional backgrounds. Many of us as reporters have come from a spatial planning background, some architecture, some from ecology, environmental management or engineering. And our past employments have been as varied as working for the Countryside Commission, National Parks, Historic Environment Scotland, SEPA, local authorities, private consultancies, legal firms, and other parts of the civil service. So we're quite a varied band of professionals with a good background. When you come into contact with DPEA, you won't contact a reporter directly. And again, that's to maintain our integrity and distance. So you'll primarily come into contact with our administration team in Falkirk, either through phone or emails. Well, what exactly do we do? Well, we process, consider and determine appeals and applications across the whole of Scotland. Last year, we processed around 850 cases. And during that time, we issued 50,000 emails and we had 58 cases which were webcast with a visitation of 39,000 people. We tend to work electronically where we can, but based on the work that we do, we sometimes need plans that are printed for, say, the elevation of buildings or visualizations of wind farms. The type of appeals that we cover are very varied. You may have and probably will have come across things like planning appeals for planning permission, listed building consent, maybe a high hedge of a neighbour or someone in the community. But you can see that we also deal with a whole range of other types of appeals like tree works, amenity notices, enforcement notices. In addition, we also work on other types of casework, which include applications and examinations. Typically, you may have come across Section 36 wind farm cases, or maybe those to do with solar or hydro. Anything over 50 megawatts is an application to ourselves. We deal with Section 37 cases for electricity transmission lines and associated way leaves. You may have been involved in community asset transfer. We also do things like core path plan examinations, gate checks for LDPs, and indeed local development plan examinations. We've got a rolling number of gate checks coming to us monthly at the minute, picking up on the new LDP system. We have an increasing number of way leaves right now in short-term let appeals. And those trends are what we try and keep abreast of, because there aren't very many of us to cover the whole of the country. So we tend to be mindful of that when we're project managing our staff, and can pull in our self-employed reporters where needed. Tonight's really about the appeals process rather than our other application work. And very, very briefly to take you through that, I've created this very simple diagram. So when someone, say, applies for planning permission or an application to a local authority, you can see here that either it can be approved, and there may be conditions attached to that, and the applicant or appellant at that time can appeal those conditions, and they would come to ourselves. Equally, if their application was refused, they have a right to appeal. And depending on the scheme of delegation for your local authority, that will either go to the local review body, and that tends to be for, say, local developments, quite small, minor scale developments, or they will come to ourselves in DPEA. Now, if they go to the local review body, that will be a quorum of locally elected members, which will make a decision on the appeal. If it comes to ourselves, then either that will be a delegated appeal to one of our reporters to determine, or it could be a recalled appeal, in which case, if it's recalled by Scottish ministers, then we will write a report, and the minister will make a decision. Either way, we'll come to a decision at the end. And then beyond that, the only recourse would be to take a case or decision to the Court of Session. And that would be by any interested party to a case. That would go mainly to the outer house, where there would be one sitting judge, or the inner house with 3 sitting judges. And then beyond that, a case could be taken to the Supreme Court. We can come back to this later if anybody has any questions. Well, who actually decides? Well, for delegated appeal decisions, it is as it says. So reporters have control over the process, and we ultimately determine the appeal. In other cases, say recalled cases or report cases, will be appointed, and we will write a report, and ministers will take into account our recommendation but come to their own view on a decision. Some examples of that might be that a planning case would go to Mr. McKee because planning's within his portfolio, or if it was energy, it would go to Miss Martin under her portfolio. In some rare cases, primarily to do with roads orders, we might be directly employed or appointed by a local authority and write and report back to them. Of interest overall, last year, 47% of delegated cases were allowed, so 53% refused. The non-delegated appeals, 29% were allowed, although that was only 2 cases. In terms of the non-appeal cases, so things like your wind farms, compulsory purchase orders, the figure was 81% allowed in the last year. Essentially, our aims and values are directed by our core values, and we're guided particularly by our codes of conduct. And there's the Scottish Government Civil Service Code of Conduct, but also many of us are members of a professional body that has code of conduct, like the Royal Town Planning Institute. And effectively, we want to work with being professional, keeping our integrity, honesty, and ensuring that we're equal and inclusive in what we do. Our objectives overall are to meet and make sound decisions and recommendations, to carry out our work as efficiently as possible and cost effectively as possible, and also to ensure that yourselves and anyone else that's involved in the appeal process or application process, your experience is a good one and is improved over time. I've put a few links here, which we can circle back to later, but essentially there's our own webpage, our annual review, which you can have a look at all the kind of casework that we deal with, and also a guide to planning appeals, which I would advise you to have a look at if you're interested. So we can come back to questions later, but for now I'll pass over to Rosie to discuss how you can get involved in planning appeals.
Thank you, Alistair. Whilst Rosie's just getting her slides ready, I was just going to come back to one thing on the the chat, and somebody rightfully said we've used the acronym LDP without explaining what it means. So for anyone who didn't get that, it's the local development plan, or LDP by short. And there's also a question about wheelies, but I'll maybe come back at the start of the Q&A and come back on that one. Sorry, Rosie.
Okay, thanks, David. Another quick show of thumbs just to make sure that people can hear me. Yes, great. I'm hoping that the screen is showing my first slide, getting involved in appeals. So thank you very much for having me along tonight. My name's Rosie Leaven and I'm another one of the reporters at DPEA. So my role tonight is to have a bit more detailed discussion about how you can get involved in appeals and to explain how we take what you say into account. So how would you get involved in an appeal? It may be that you're aware of an appeal because the Community Council has been formally notified, or it could be through neighbour notification, or it could be through general awareness. If something is controversial or popular locally, it may have been in the local press or all over social media. So if you are aware of something that you've not been formally notified of, depending on the timing, you may still be able to make comments to us at the appeal stage. But if you've already made a representation to the council on a specific planning application, then you will be notified if that decision is appealed, and your original representation will be copied to us and we'll be able to take that into account. So there's no need for you to make another representation to us. But if something new has emerged, like a change to the site or a new policy, then you could of course set out your comments on that to us, and you have 14 days from receiving the appeal notification to make any. Right, can everybody see me again? Getting involved in appeals, we're on slide 12. So I was just saying, if something new had emerged, like a change to the site or a new policy, then you could obviously set your comments out on that to us, and you'd have 14 days to do that from when you're notified. But just to reiterate, we do receive all the consultations and the representations that were sent to the council on the case. As we operate deadlines for each case, we will not generally accept late representations unless there's a very good reason, and that's for the reporter to determine. Sometimes if we know that the process is going to take longer, for example, we know we're going to request further information from the appellant, then there may be a little bit more flexibility in terms of deadlines for comments, but it's not a given. And if you're not already aware, we have a more detailed guidance note, which you may find useful on how to take part in planning appeals in other cases. That's the link at the bottom of the screen there, and it is available from the front page of the DPEA website, which looks like the image on the screen there. And from there, you'll be able to access our case management system to search all of our cases and decisions. So how do we determine an appeal? Well, the reporter will decide on the process, and the key thing is whether further information is required. In some cases, it's perfectly possible for us to determine the case on the basis of what we have in front of us, what's been submitted. But in other cases, it may not be possible. For example, an appeal against non-determination by the authority. I think that was something that was raised by one of the participants in advance of this evening. With those cases, it may be that there are some gaps in the evidence. Sometimes we will have a detailed response from the council and sometimes we won't, and we might need to probe on specific issues to try and establish the council's views. But generally we will have all of the representations that have been made, and as I mentioned on my last slide, you can make further comments to us at that stage if you wish. But we're considering the same proposal that was before the council, so it's not an opportunity for the appellant to change the proposal and try and get permission for something slightly different. And the description of the development should not change at the appeal stage. Throughout the process, it's important to say we're not actively seeking new evidence, we're just making sure that there's enough evidence for us to determine the appeal. And we normally take evidence at face value unless it's clearly disputed or clearly inaccurate. For example, if calculations that have been submitted don't add up. Soon after we get a new case, we'll look through all the written evidence that's been submitted, including the representations and the consultation responses. And the authority's response on the appeal is quite important. The authority has 14 days to submit that after the appeal comes in, which is the same timescale as that for representations. And we would wait for the council's response and the end of the representations period before deciding on whether any further procedure is required. And that further procedure could be further written submissions, a site visit, a hearing, or an inquiry. Further written submissions might be something simple like comments on a newly issued policy, or it might be a more detailed request to explain the results of an assessment in more detail. It could even be a requirement for an additional assessment or a survey to be carried out. But if further written submissions are required, then we would issue what's called a procedure notice, and that will set out exactly what we need, from whom, by when. And it's important that everything is transparent and all the documents that the parties are relying on are submitted and included on our case management system so that everyone has access to the same evidence. And that would be available through our website. I will get into a bit more detail on the other procedures in a moment. Once we have all the information we need, if it's a planning appeal, we will move to determine the case in accordance with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And I'm going to expand later in my presentation on those material considerations. For other types of appeal, there are other statutory matters that we are required to assess the proposal against, but whatever the test is, it should be set out at the start of the decision letter. And as Alistair has mentioned, we determine most appeals ourselves, but some are determined by ministers. So I want to say a little bit more about the other procedures that you might get involved in, starting with site visits. Not all cases will need a site visit. For example, in some enforcement cases or short-term let appeals, there's no dispute that the development has taken place, and the debate is more around whether the development requires planning permission, or it might be about the timescale for remedying an enforcement issue. So written evidence and photographs can confirm matters without the need to see it in person. For other cases, it is important to understand the site in its context, particularly in relation to effects on neighbouring land and properties. And for most of these, we can do the site visit unaccompanied because we can get access to the site without needing doors or gates unlocked. But if we do need to get access to a field or a site that's locked, or we need to get inside someone's property, then we will need to do what's called an accompanied site visit. So in that case, the appellant, the council, and the interested parties, which might be community groups or individuals, will then be invited to attend for fairness. But this is not a public meeting and it's not a hearing. It is simply for the reporter to understand the evidence on the ground. And for those reasons, we can't discuss the merits of the case, and new issues can't be raised by any of the parties that are attending. And the reporter will set this out at the start of the visit. It can be a little bit difficult when people want to get into a bit of debate about the case, but we will remind parties to focus on pointing out anything referred to in evidence. And it might be something like the location of a particular access point or a protected tree, rather than discussing whether the proposal is a good thing or not. And remember that we have all the written evidence, so we will have already seen what's been said in representations, and from that we'll be looking out for things to check on site. In more complex cases, it's sometimes necessary to hold a hearing or an inquiry to examine the issues in more detail, and some of you may have experience of those. And these can either be in person or virtual, depending on what's most effective for the number of participants and the types of issues that are being discussed. Hearings tend to be useful where the reporter wants to ask questions about the evidence or get more detailed explanations from the parties. Usually it will be on the parties' opinions on policy or design matters. And these are fairly informal, and they'll be based around an agenda that the reporter has prepared and sent out in advance. No lawyers or professional witnesses are required, and there is no cross-examination, but questions can be asked of the parties through the reporter. Everyone who's participating will be asked to set out a hearing statement in advance so that everyone can see the evidence and that the other party is putting forward. And that also helps the reporter to focus the agenda. Inquiries are used commonly for more complex matters where there's a dispute on detailed factual or technical evidence which needs to be thoroughly tested by cross-examination. The appellants and the council usually will have lawyers to support them, but again, you do not need a lawyer and you can represent yourself, or you can group together with others raising similar concerns and have one person appear on behalf of you all. In many cases, particularly wind farm inquiries, the council may be making the same or similar points to the community, and it may be that you could work with the council and be represented through them. Certainly from our perspective, the reporters really want to understand your views clearly and will try their best to support you to do this. You must be prepared to be questioned on your evidence, but we will be monitoring what's going on, and we will be making sure that questioning is fair, making sure that you have time to consider your answer. And if we think any questioning is aggressive or personal, then we would intervene. You will also have the opportunity to question the appellant or the counsel or any other parties attending, such as statutory consultees. And as with hearings, if you decide to participate, then you would be asked to submit an inquiry report in advance to set out your evidence. You can't appear on the day and present new evidence that the others have not had a chance to consider. If there's going to be an inquiry, there would be a pre-examination meeting in advance with all the parties to discuss the arrangements for the inquiry and set dates. No discussion on the merits of the case takes place at that meeting. But we are keen to accommodate the community's needs in terms of dates, timings, whether sessions should be virtual or in person, and we would take all of these matters into account and your opinions on that in deciding on the best timetable and format. We have found that sometimes a community hearing is useful as part of an inquiry process. We've found in some wind farm cases, for example, that having a distinct session for community interests can help them to set out their concerns. It can work really well. We can have the appellants in attendance, and it avoids the need for communities to engage in lengthy inquiry sessions or be cross-examined by the appellant's lawyers. But it really depends on the case and on the type of concerns, and it's ultimately for the reporter in each case to decide. More detailed guidance is available in our guidance note on taking part in planning appeals and other cases that I've already mentioned. And if you are getting involved in a hearing or an inquiry, the case officers in the administration team at DPEA will be very happy to discuss the process with you and answer any questions that you may have. Moving towards the end of my presentation now, I want to highlight a few points just about making effective representations. The key to this is basing the concerns on material considerations, and my next slide will expand on what those might be. But if you can identify relevant development plan policies that link to your concerns, then that's very helpful. And obviously now we're talking about the local development plan and the national planning framework. You can include photos and other illustrative material, but beware if you're using your own drawings or plans that ideally that they are to scale so that they can be properly assessed. And it is helpful if you can highlight issues that you think the reporter should examine on a site visit, things like access points, particular buildings or windows that might be affected, particular viewpoints that we should visit. And again, there's no need to use formal or legal language. The key thing is flagging up your insider knowledge as local residents and communities. What is special to you that others might not be aware of? Is there a local path that will be affected? Is there shared access? Are there existing traffic problems? Does the site flood regularly? This sort of local knowledge is invaluable to us. And importantly for us, the issue is not so much about the number of representations, but whether the issues being raised are valid planning matters. And on that, to try and help explain the sorts of things we would take into account and what we would not, then I've summarised some issues in the table here. And the material considerations are based on those that are set out in Circular 3 of 2013 on development management procedures, which you can find online if you want to have a look at that in a bit more detail. On the left are the sorts of things that would likely be a factor in a decision. And these include national policy, the development plan, the community plan, various effects that are relating to the development and use of land and buildings, such as effects on the environment, design, access, etc. And this would include legitimate public concern on these sorts of matters. On the right are the sorts of things that would not likely factor in a decision, things like effects on property values, who it is who owns the land is not relevant as long as they've been notified, and the loss of a private view from a house. But the loss of a key public view could be an issue. For example, building a tower block in front of Edinburgh Castle, which obscured the castle, would clearly be an important factor. Obviously, we can't discuss particular cases tonight, and we can't say that a particular issue will always be material in a case, because it really depends each time on the particular development and the particular site. But the essence of our job is to try and balance all the relevant factors and come to a reasoned decision. So I hope that gives you an indication of what we are looking for and what you should try and focus your representations on. Finally, I wanted to say a few words just about how we ensure consistency in our decision making. And this is a big concern for those affected by planning decisions, and it is obviously a key issue for all reporters too. In order to support that, we carry out regular internal training for all reporters on current and emerging policies and planning issues, on new case types, or refreshers on some of our more regular cases. For example, there's a huge number of short-term let appeals coming into the system now, particularly in Edinburgh, but also elsewhere. And that is something that we have, as a group of reporters, spent a lot of time considering and ensuring that we all have a similar understanding of the issues and how we might address them. Through the case management system, we can access new decisions as they are issued, as you can, and we consider those decisions, and if there's been a legal challenge on one of those decisions, then we will look at that in detail in terms of any similar cases that we are dealing with. Sometimes parties to an appeal will draw our specific attention to a previous DPEA decision that has been taken on a nearby site or for a similar type of development. And we would obviously look at those as part of our assessment, but each case is different and we must always decide a case on its own merits. So something that looks like a similar type of development will have a different impact on a different site. Or it may be that new evidence or a new policy has emerged since a previous decision, and that a different decision may now be justified. And that is ultimately a matter of professional judgment, drawing on our experience and taking into account all the evidence that's in front of us. And we should explain that clearly in our decision. So I hope that gives you an understanding of how to effectively get involved in appeals and other casework. It's a quick run through of the issues and how we take the evidence into account. And we'll certainly be happy to get into a bit more detail in questions. So I'm going to pass over now to David from Planning Aid, and he's going to say a little bit more about his role.
Well, thanks very much, everybody. I'm assuming everyone can see my slides. Somebody can, yeah, thanks, Rosie. And thanks to the DPEA for inviting us along. I won't be speaking for too long. This is more about getting the questions answered and heard from the participants. So I'll speak for about 5 minutes. I'm David Wood. I'm a planner, chartered planner. I've been working at the charity social enterprise Planning Aid Scotland for the last almost 16 years. So it's been the most longest term job I've had in my career, although I was a career change into planning in my 30s, having done a few other things. I'm just going to run, I'm hoping that a lot of people here will know who we are. Community councils are definitely a key audience for us as a planning charity, and I do from time to time come across community councils or community councillors who have not heard about us or are newly established. So it's just a very short awareness raiser about who we are. So it's actually the 30th year since we were established as a charity, you know, and I do say thanks to the original founder members. We were a group of Scottish planners who built on the recognition, and really in the late 60s and 70s, that communities often don't have a voice in planning and feel things are happening to rather than with them. And I'm not saying that situations has radically changed. I think it has changed, and I would hope improved in some ways. But that's our mission statement. You know, we sometimes say we're the citizens' advice for planning, and we do work with people as they experience planning on the streets at the grassroots level as best we can. I'm not going to read out everything on the slides. That gives you an idea of what our strategic priorities as a charity are. And on the next slides, I'll run through the actual activities that we deliver. I think being a learning organisation is really important. We are not perfect. We don't know all the answers. We're all learning as we go along, as the planning system evolves. Mainstreaming community planning. I mean, that can be done to a certain extent in some aspects of planning, but obviously planning proposals are often led by developers, and it is a regulatory system and a forward planning system as well, where a lot of power is devolved to authority, initially the planning authority. As we're discussing today, some decisions go to the DPEA and Scottish ministers. This is really how Planning Aid Scotland all started, and they used to meet. They had no IT, no funding. They had an answer phone machine in one of the founder members' flat, and they would meet in a wee pub just up the close from Waverley Station called Jingling Geordie's, and discuss the allocation of cases from probably primarily community groups at that point needing advice. We're funded by the Scottish Government for this aspect of our work, but not and to exist as an organisation. Other work is social enterprise work, where we maybe source or work with community groups or clients to achieve funding to do the work we would like to do in line with our values. But this is a free advice service subject to a few eligibility criteria. So in terms of development, we would help people build their own house or a small business startup. If somebody had land and wanted to build 10 houses or even 2 houses, we would advise going to a planning consultant or architect. We get a huge range of stuff, from a lot of householder stuff. People literally don't know if they need planning permission to knock down a wall between their house and the garage, and increasingly since COVID, people do want to do that. Generally, you won't need planning permission. About planning applications, making representations, objections, promoting their own planning application, about enforcement, also about planning appeals, and much more. And we acknowledge that it's planning appeals are quite challenging, particularly when you reach hearing or public inquiry stage. There's not that many public inquiries in Scotland, but when we are approached, we will try to offer what we can to people who are involved. We're not a campaigning group. We can't be we're impartial, as it says in the bullet points, and that's really a key thing about the organisation. We can't be a consultant for people. There are more campaigning groups where we can cross-refer people to where that feels appropriate. It's fully confidential. All of advice is always from a chartered planner, and it's led by staff and volunteers. We're not trying to do it all for you. It's trying to educate and help people move forward. We also, the founder members always envisaged moving towards doing training events to try and upstream people's engagement in the planning system. Very much so for community councils, also elected members, but also stakeholder groups such as charities. We've done training for Sustrans Scotland, Cycling UK, and many others over the years. I should have said, advice service, if a community group wanted an hour or so on Teams or Zoom with us, or we would even go out if we could find volunteer capacity in person. We'll do a talk on the planning system for new community groups as an extension of our advice service. We very much, in the last 10 years, have been involved in community engagement projects, and we don't see with our impartial outsider perspective. I sometimes think that sounds negative, but actually that can be a positive when you're working with a community, that to bring in somebody from outside. I'm going to talk briefly about community-led plans, and I'll sort of wrap it up after that. But in terms of community engagement projects, we've done engagement on behalf of a couple of local authorities in the context of the local development plan with children and young people, and the Gypsy Traveller and Travelling Showpersons community. And we've done quite a bit of work around building capacity for communities to get involved in local place plans, which I'll briefly touch on. So yeah, a big part of our work has been community-led plans. That could be a community action plan or a local place plan. I won't go into the difference between the two. There's overlap and differences. That was us up in Applecross, which was quite nice. I got to go 3 times, and they were looking to work with the council landowner. It's privately owned estate, essentially, other stakeholders to find sites for new affordable houses for elderly people. We do respond, like most charities, to Scottish Government policy consultations. which I handle, though I'm not a full-time policy officer at all, from the perspective of user experience and effective engagement, some things we won't get involved with. That was an important recent one for us, because I mean, it's great when communities and individuals can get involved in the local development plan early, but that needs effective engagement and reach out from the councils. And just finally, a volunteer, I'd say volunteer-based organisation. We've got a few hundred planners who, when they have time, contribute to helping us deliver their services. And I think communities quite like that sometimes, that we do have volunteers who are offering their own time. So yeah, thank you to all of them, and to Alistair for everything that you did when you were a volunteer. And just thanks very much. If there's any questions, maybe pop them in the chat and we can come back to them, or just get in touch with me. And I'm just going to pop the link to our advice service in the chat.